I used to use it regularly to go and see the matches that I was interested in on Court 1. I won't go there now. I won't go anywhere near.
For decades, Cliff Richard stood as one of the most adored and enduring icons in music history. His voice shaped eras, his charisma lit up stages across the world, and his presence became a constant source of joy for millions. Yet almost overnight, it felt like he simply vanished. Concerts stopped. Interviews disappeared. His public appearances became rare shadows of what they once were. And fans everywhere were left with one haunting question. Why did Cliff Richard suddenly step away from the spotlight? After giving his entire life to it? The truth is far more heartbreaking than anyone imagined. Behind the polished success and the smiling stage persona was a man carrying the weight of devastating accusations. Relentless media intrusion, personal heartbreak, and a changing music world that refused to slow down for him. Cliff Richard wasn't just exhausted, he was broken. He found himself fighting for his reputation, his privacy, and even his identity, and while the cameras turned away, thinking the story was over, the real story was only beginning. Cliff Richard disappeared because he was facing a battle that nearly destroyed him from the inside out, a battle no audience ever saw. Today, we finally reveal what really happened, why he walked away, and why for more than 60 years, Cliff Richard was unstoppable. From the moment he burst onto the scene in the late 1950s, he became a symbol of clean-cut charm, youthful energy, and undeniable talent. While Elvis Presley conquered America, Cliff held the United Kingdom in the palm of his hand. He wasn't just a singer. He was a phenomenon. Every song release felt like an event, every tour sold out, and every appearance drew screaming crowds. Generations grew up with his voice echoing through their homes, linking memories, relationships, and even entire eras to his music. But what most people never knew was how exhausting it can be to remain an icon for that long. Fame is a spotlight that burns, and Cliff Richard lived beneath it for longer than nearly anyone in music history. The pressure to stay relevant, to stay perfect, to stay beloved, it never stopped. Over the years, he watched the culture change around him. New stars rose, technology transformed the industry, and young audiences shifted their attention to louder, flashier names. Even then, Cliff held on, determined not to let time erase him. Yet, the world rarely notices what constant visibility does to the soul. Cliff smiled for cameras even on days when the weight of loneliness sat heavily on his chest. He performed for roaring crowds even when grief and exhaustion clouded his mind. Friends later recalled that his success came with a price. Cliff never truly belonged to himself. The public owned him. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Cliff continued touring relentlessly, achieving milestones that most artists can only dream of. But privately, he began feeling the slow pull of emotional fatigue. In interviews, his eyes told stories of someone craving something simple: peace, privacy, and a life outside the frame. Things took a darker turn in the early 2000s, though he was still respected. The music world around him evolved at a rate he couldn't keep up with. Younger artists dominated charts, tabloids turned crueler, and social media created a new form of public judgment, instant, merciless, and global. Cliff Richard suddenly felt exposed in ways he never had before. Then, tragedy struck in the most unexpected form: false allegations. When Cliff was accused of historical sexual misconduct, the world he had built over a lifetime began crumbling. Though the claims were never proven and ultimately led to no charges, the damage was immediate and brutal. Cameras swarmed his home. News outlets treated him like he was already guilty. People questioned his character. For Cliff Richard, someone who had spent his entire life preserving a clean reputation, the humiliation was unimaginable. Friends said it shattered his spirit. He later admitted the experience left a permanent scar, calling it one of the darkest of his existence. The ordeal didn't just tarnish his public image, it shook his relationship with music itself. He no longer felt safe on stage or in interviews. Every microphone looked like a weapon. Every audience like a courtroom. It was then that Cliff began to disappear. First, small steps. Fewer tours, fewer media appearances, and longer stretches of silence between releases. Then, almost completely, he faded from view. Fans feared the worst. Was he ill? Was he retiring? Did he simply give up? The truth is, Cliff Richard had nothing left to prove. And more importantly, he no longer had the emotional strength to fight every day just to exist in the public eye. For the first time since childhood, he chose stillness over spotlight. He chose privacy over applause. Cliff Richard's sudden disappearance wasn't about fading fame, it was about survival. And in the next section, the devastating reason behind his withdrawal becomes painfully clear. His silence truly means. When Cliff Richard finally stepped away from the public spotlight. It seemed sudden to outsiders, but those close to him later revealed just how long the decision had been building. Fame had not only exhausted him, it nearly destroyed him. And what came after those false accusations was even more brutal. Silence. For decades, Cliff Richard lived surrounded by music, movement, and noise. There was always something happening: rehearsals, interviews, studio sessions, charity events, world tours. His homes were often filled with people: dancers, musicians, managers, reporters. His phone rang constantly. His life never paused. But when the accusations hit, everything froze. Friends say the silence inside his house was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It terrified him at first. He stopped writing. He stopped answering calls. For months, he reportedly barely touched his guitars or piano. The joy he once found in melodies simply wasn't there anymore. One friend said it was like watching a man who had been plugged into a bright electrical current. His whole life suddenly switch off completely. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Every day, Cliff faced the same haunting question. How do you rebuild your identity when the world has convinced itself you're someone else? The BBC raid on his home broadcast worldwide left him feeling violated in a way he could not explain. Millions saw officers searching his private rooms, rifling through drawers and closets while helicopters filmed from above. Cliff Richard later said it made him feel less than human, as though his dignity no longer mattered. Even after being cleared, the humiliation lingered. The damage was done. People had already decided what they wanted to believe, and with that public suspicion came something even more devastating: isolation. Cliff had always been surrounded by fans who adored him, but after the scandal, many disappeared. Concerts became harder to fill. Ticket sales dropped. He received far fewer letters. The fear of seeing judgment in strangers' eyes made him avoid public spaces. Supermarkets, restaurants, sidewalks, places he once moved through freely became emotional minefields. At the same time, Cliff faced a physical battle he had kept hidden for years. Aging brought pain, aching joints, tired muscles, and worsening vocal strain. His voice, once a soaring, remarkable instrument, no longer responded the way it did in his 20s. Notes that once came effortlessly now required brutal concentration. He hated the idea of fans hearing anything less than perfection, and the fear of disappointing them haunted him. Behind closed doors, Cliff began questioning everything. Should he return to music at all? Should he continue performing? Should he even remain in the UK, where the press had turned his life into entertainment? Then came the loneliness, an emotional shadow greater than any physical pain. Though Cliff had friendships, he never married and never had children. During the chaos, he realized there would be no one to come home to every night. No companion to reassure him that everything would be okay. Fame had given him wealth and success, but it demanded sacrifice. Now he was left wondering if the price had been too high. Cliff eventually made the painful decision to leave England. For long stretches at a time, he began spending more of his life in Portugal and Barbados, far from the relentless media environment. These places offered warmth, calm, and anonymity, and for the first time in decades, he felt something close to normalcy. But disappearing from the public eye came with a consequence that stunned his fans. Cliff Richard almost entirely walked away from recording music. The man who once released new albums year after year seemed to vanish artistically. Rumors exploded. Some said he was gravely ill. Others whispered that he was secretly planning retirement. A few even claimed he was preparing a goodbye project, a final album that would never be released unless he died. The truth is much more human. Cliff had lost the emotional safety needed to create. He didn't want to sing into a world that doubted him. Music had always been his sanctuary, and now the very thing that shaped his identity reminded him only of pain. Friends say the turning point came when Cliff admitted that every time he thought about stepping back into the studio, He imagined headlines attacking him again. He feared working would reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. And so, piece by piece, Cliff Richard slipped further out of the spotlight, not because his career faded, but because he chose to protect what remained of his spirit. In the next section, we'll dive into what Cliff Richard's life looks like today and the heartbreaking reason he may never fully return to the stage again. Away from the spotlight. Cliff Richard tried to rebuild his life, but what he discovered was both healing and painfully revealing. Fans imagined he was resting on quiet beaches, enjoying retirement in paradise. But the truth was far more complicated. Cliff was not on vacation. He was learning how to exist without applause for the first time since his teenage years. In Portugal, where his villa rests above rolling vineyards, Cliff found comfort in small routines the world never saw. He woke without alarms. He cooked his own breakfast. He took long, silent walks through the garden. And, at night, instead of rehearsing for shows, he played records from other artists, songs he loved as a child, melodies untouched by scandal. These moments were peaceful, yet they also revealed something heartbreaking. Cliff realized that without music crowds, without fan letters, and without constant travel, he did not know who he was anymore. He had never experienced a normal adulthood. Fame arrived when he was barely old enough to understand its consequences. For decades, the world defined him, his image, his behavior, his identity. But in Portugal, far from reporters and cameras, Cliff began confronting pieces of himself he had ignored. Questions surfaced in the quiet. Did he chase music because he loved it or because he feared loneliness? Had the world ever loved the real Cliff Richard or just the version they projected onto him? The years of pressure from tabloids and accusations had changed him. Cliff's close friends noticed that the once endlessly cheerful man had grown more guarded. Even casual conversations felt different. He was slower to trust, slower to laugh, slower to offer warmth. Trauma had reshaped his personality. One friend described watching Cliff pick up a guitar and tune it carefully, only to set it down minutes later with a sigh. He missed performing desperately, but the emotional courage it required seemed out of reach. Music to Cliff had always been a shared energy, audience to stage, stage to audience. Without that connection, singing felt hollow. As time passed, the world around him changed too. New generations pushed older legends aside. Music executives who once begged for Cliff's albums stopped calling. Younger crowds knew his name, but not his story. And Cliff, once a revolutionary voice who helped bring rock and roll to Britain, felt himself becoming a museum piece. It hurt more than he expected, but perhaps the most painful truth was physical. Cliff Richard, the man who once sprinted across stages for 2-hour shows, began facing the undeniable reality of age. His voice, although still strong, tired quickly. Concert stamina vanished. His breathing changed. Medical specialists warned him he would have to adjust his singing style if he ever performed again. For a perfectionist like Cliff, that advice felt like a coffin closing. He also struggled to accept seeing friends pass away. Fellow musicians, people who had stood beside him on tours, award stages, and photo shoots were gone. Cliff once admitted privately that every funeral felt like a reminder that he might spend his old age alone. Through all this, fans continued asking the same question. Why doesn't he just come back? Why not release one more album? Why not go on one final tour? The heartbreaking answer: Cliff feared the world no longer wanted him. After the accusations, after the court battles, after the headlines, he felt his legacy had been stained. He believed that every new project would be judged not by its music, but by his past humiliation. He once said to a friend, "I don't want to return unless people are glad to see me." But in reality, millions of people still loved him. Letters continued to arrive at his homes in both Barbados and Portugal. Older fans wrote about how his songs helped them survive divorces, illnesses, and deaths. Young listeners discovered his catalog, calling him a lost treasure. Yet Cliff struggled to believe any of it truly mattered. His withdrawal wasn't about abandonment, it was about survival. Fame had taken pieces of him for decades, and now he was trying to reclaim what remained: peace, dignity, and privacy. But what Cliff didn't expect was that silence would soon bring something even darker: regret. Whispers grew that Cliff Richard was preparing something shocking. Something that might explain why he has stayed silent for so long. As the years passed, Cliff Richard's absence from the spotlight transformed from temporary silence into something far more permanent. And now, when people ask whether he will ever return to the stage, the truth is painfully complicated. His future is shaped by a mixture of emotional trauma, aging reality, and a surprising choice that shocked even those closest to him. For Cliff, the question became less about whether he could perform again and more about whether he should. The stage had always been a sanctuary, a place where the world's noise faded and only music mattered. But now, performing meant returning to the same world that once stripped him bare, publicly humiliated him, and left him fighting to breathe under the weight of false judgment. In his silence, Cliff began to understand something most celebrities never allow themselves to see. Fame had been both the love of his life and the greatest thief he ever knew. Privately, he admitted that the stage carried ghosts. Every spotlight reminded him of who he once was. Every song reminded him of fans who disappeared when he needed support. Every auditorium reminded him of a world he no longer trusted. Cliff feared that stepping back on stage would reopen wounds he'd spent years stitching shut. But there was another side of his disappearance, one deeply personal and far less discussed. Cliff Richard had always lived a life shaped by discipline and image. He never married, never had children, and rarely allowed any romantic connection to be public. In his younger years, fans saw this as part of his mystique. Now in older age, that privacy has become a quiet burden. Those close to Cliff say he wrestles with a loneliness that fame once disguised. He has no partner sharing his home at night, no adult children visiting him on holidays, and no spouse urging him back into the world. When he retreats too far, music once filled that emotional space, but after the scandal, music became painful. Without a replacement, loneliness crept in. That is why Cliff began pouring himself into quieter passions: faith, charity work, gardening, and long conversations with close friends. Those who know him say he has become gentle, reflective, philosophical. He speaks openly about time, forgiveness, and regret. He laughs at old memories and cries when recalling the people he has lost. And while Cliff still sings at home, sometimes humming softly through his hallways, sometimes playing piano when no one is watching, he no longer sings with the force of a man preparing for a tour. His voice today is fragile, but still beautiful. Yet fans may never hear it live again for one heartbreaking reason. Cliff Richard believes that performing now would change how people remember him. He wants his legacy frozen in brilliance, not altered by age. He fears hitting a flat note under the bright lights. He fears a trembling hand holding a microphone. He fears headlines mocking a man who once defined an era. In his mind, stopping now preserves everything he worked for. Friends have heard him say, "I've given the world enough. Maybe it's time to give something to myself." That something is peace. Cliff Richard, after decades of cameras, tours, screaming audiences, and unforgiving schedules, has chosen to age quietly and on his own terms. He no longer measures life by chart rankings or ticket sales. Instead, he measures life by mornings without stress, meals without paparazzi flashes, and sunsets viewed from porches far away from London tabloids. And yet, there remains a spark of possibility. Some insiders claim Cliff has quietly written new music. Others whisper he has recorded unreleased material and locked it away, planning to release it only if he passes away. They say he wants his last artistic breath to be heard without interruption or judgment. Whether these rumors are true hardly matters. What matters is this: Cliff Richard is not gone. He is simply living unseen. His disappearance from the spotlight was not defeat, it was protection. His choice to step back was not weakness, it was courage, and maybe that is the final truth fans never expected. Cliff Richard didn't fade away because his career was ending. He faded away because, for the first time in his life, he chose himself over fame. For those who loved him, his silence may feel sad, but for Cliff Richard, it is finally freedom.